Before we begin, if you enjoy gritty crime biographies told like a whispered secret in the dark, subscribe now. These stories aren't just written, they're lived. Franky Boy. Cali didn't talk much. He didn't need to. In the world he came from, quiet meant control, and silence meant power. Most gangsters flashed their watches, barked orders, and walked like they owned every corner of Brooklyn. Franky Boy? He strolled. Always calm, always polite, always watching. You wouldn't hear about him in the tabloids like Gotti. He wasn't built for spotlights. Franky Boy worked behind them. His life was a long, slow burn, the kind that lights quietly but leaves the whole room smoky. And let's go back, far from Staten Island, across the ocean where his story really began. To Sicily. The streets of Palermo smelled of salt and roasted almonds in the spring. Narrow roads twisted through faded buildings where old men smoked with their shirts unbuttoned and children kicked soccer balls against cracked walls. That's where Franky's bloodline walked, before America ever knew his name. His ancestors were tied to the Inzerillo clan, a powerful family with roots tangled deep into Sicily's soil. These weren't corner store hustlers. They were men who whispered over espresso in courtyards while ordering executions with a nod. When the Mafia war broke out in the 1980s, the one they still whisper about today, it wasn't just bullets and blood. It was exile, revenge. Whole families fled Sicily after the Corleonese faction started stacking bodies like firewood. Some ended up in Brooklyn. Frank Cali's family was among them. He was born in New York in 1965, but his soul was Sicilian. He grew up in an Italian house that never truly left Palermo. The food, the language, the customs, it was all preserved like it had been smuggled in someone's suitcase from the old world. Frank was different from the other kids. He didn't run wild in the streets trying to prove something. He didn't have to. Even as a teenager, he had a way of sitting still that made older men stop talking. He got made quietly in the late 1990s. No press, no showy suits, no welcome to the family drama. He rose through the Gambino ranks like smoke through cracks in a wall. People just started noticing he was there, and when he spoke, others stopped. By 2003, he was already controlling things most captains would kill to touch. Construction deals, port access, and deep ties to the Sicilian underworld. But Franky Boy didn't just have Sicilian connections. He was the bridge. Cali opened doors back to Palermo. He helped the exiled Inzerillo family reestablish themselves in the old country, something most believed was impossible after the Mafia wars. That move didn't just make Franky powerful, it made him untouchable. He wasn't a killer in the classic sense. He didn't need to be. His weapon was leverage, calm conversation, strategic silence. And while the city slept, Franky Boy built a silent empire under the noses of federal agents, rival crews, and even his own friends. But silence, no matter how deep, doesn't last forever. In March 2019, at the quiet edge of Staten Island, someone rang his doorbell. It was late. He stepped outside, still polite, still calm, maybe thinking it was a mistake. But it wasn't. Franky Boy, Cali took 6 bullets that night, shot in front of his home, near his SUV, in a neighborhood where nobody dared speak his name. The hit was messy, loud, clumsy, everything he never was. But here's the thing. You don't kill a man like Frank Cali with bullets. You just kill his body. The rest? That stays buried in history, in silence, and in every street that still fears the Sicilian bloodline he carried in his veins. The sea was always there. That deep, endless blue horizon stretching out from the coast of Palermo, watching every secret the land tried to bury. And in the early 1980s, that sea became an escape route, not for dreamers, but for hunted men. Frank Cali's bloodline was soaked in that escape. The Inzerillos weren't just any mafia family. They were aristocracy in the underworld, wealthy, sharp, ruthless, and proud. They ruled Palermo with quiet sophistication, not chaos. But their calm grip on power made them enemies of the wrong man, Totò Riina. the butcher of Corleone. Reina didn't believe in balance, he believed in dominance, and when he unleashed his purge across Sicily, it wasn't just a war, it was annihilation. The Inzerillo family was marked for extinction. One by one they were hunted, shot in daylight, dragged from their homes, their bodies left in the streets, messages carved into skin, bullets sent through heads at close range. Reina didn't want prisoners, he wanted their bloodline erased, but a deal was struck in the shadows, whispered by desperate survivors and blessed by American bosses. The remaining Inzerillos could escape to the United States, but they could never return. Not to visit, not to die. If even one came back, the truce was off, and the slaughter would resume. That's how they ended up in New York. Brooklyn didn't welcome outsiders easily, even Sicilian ones. But blood recognizes blood. The Gambino family, rooted in both America and Sicily, opened the gates. They didn't do it out of charity. They did it because the Inzerillos brought knowledge, money, and centuries-old connections with them. Among those arriving was a cousin, a brother, an uncle, all of them with the same dark eyes, the same silent posture, the same quiet fire. Frank Cali's family wasn't just part of this history. They were this history. Frank watched it all from the corners of rooms, the edges of tables, the back seats of cars. He was a teenager then. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have to. His uncle spoke in Sicilian when the details got bloody. The women in the house would hum louder in the kitchen to drown out the darker conversations. Frank, always polite, always respectful, would just sit at the table stirring espresso, absorbing everything. And while the streets outside were full of noise, rap music, dice games, corner fights, the Cali house stayed calm, controlled, like Palermo had been before the purge. By the time Frank turned 20, he already knew the rules. Power is patience, money moves quietly, and revenge, that takes years. He wasn't a street-level guy. He didn't sling dope on corners or beat down debtors in alleyways. Frank was taught differently. He wore suits even when no one was watching. He spoke slowly, and he learned early how to make people listen without raising his voice. The Gambinos noticed. In the 1990s, after the chaos of the Gotti era, the family was starving for structure. The flashy days were over. Cameras were poison. Every loudmouth underboss who craved fame was either locked up or buried in Jersey soil. Frank rose in that silence. He didn't ask for power. He earned it by never slipping, never leaking, never drawing attention, and by leaning deep into something the American bosses didn't fully understand, the old Sicilian ways. His connections to the Inzerillos made him a bridge. Palermo trusted him. Brooklyn trusted him. And when it came time to make deals across the ocean, narcotics, fake construction bids, port contracts, money laundering, Frank was the man both sides called. By 2003, he was already influencing international rackets from Staten Island. And yet, he still lived like a man who stocked shelves at a deli. He drove modest cars. He lived in a brick house with a driveway and a dog. His neighbors said he smiled often, picked up his mail, and waved to kids. But behind that soft exterior was a brain built for war. A war that wasn't fought with guns anymore, but with politics, money, and leverage. Frank understood that better than anyone. In 2008, the FBI launched a massive operation. Wiretaps, undercover agents, indictments. Mob names were dropped all over the news, some real, some blown out of proportion. Cali was arrested too, but the case barely stuck. He took the charge like a gentleman, didn't flip, didn't complain, served his time and walked out stronger. Because in prison, he made friends. And on the outside, people noticed who didn't talk, who didn't rat. That's when the whispers started. Some said Frank was next in line. Others said he was already pulling strings behind the curtain. Either way, one thing was clear. Frank Cali wasn't just another made guy. He was a strategist. The kind of man who could rebuild the Gambino family without a single public shootout. Under him, things stabilized. No more tabloid headlines, no flashy funerals, no John Gotti 2.0, just business. Ports were greased, unions stayed friendly, Construction projects moved forward, and all of it with minimal bloodshed, at least on American soil. But Palermo, that was different. After Rina died in prison in 2017, the old truce was weakened. The insurrios, now scattered across America and Europe, started whispering again. Maybe it was time to return. Maybe the exiled bloodline had waited long enough. Frank was at the center of that storm. Some say he encouraged it. Others claim he warned against it. What's certain is this: he met with powerful figures from both sides of the ocean in quiet restaurants. Long dinners, short sentences, deep glances. He was building something international, something dangerous. And that made people nervous. Because in the underworld, when a man gains too much influence, when both the old country and the new world trust him, someone always feels threatened. In 2018, Cali was believed to have quietly assumed control of the Gambino family. Not in a flashy boss of bosses announcement, no, in whispered respect, in obedience, in nods passed around at weddings and wakes. He didn't need to declare himself, everyone knew. But leadership doesn't protect you. It paints a target on your back. And in this life, targets never fade. They just wait. In early 2019, strange things started happening. Rumors of a power shift, new players sniffing around Staten Island, tension in the air. But Frank didn't flinch. He still went to dinner, still kissed his wife, still walked his dog. Because that's how he lived. Calm, polite, unshaken. Until that night in March. A man rang his bell. Some say it was a setup. Some say it was a twisted mix of personal grievance and ambition. But when Frank stepped outside, something shifted. The man had lured him out with a story. A car accident, a fender bender. It was nothing really, just a lie. But Frank, ever respectful, walked out to handle it like a gentleman. He got 6 bullets in return. Neighbors said the shots were fast, loud, final. He collapsed near his SUV. His family rushed outside, screaming. Lights flicked on. Calls were made. But by the time the ambulance arrived, Frank Cali was gone. The man who rebuilt the Gambino family, the silent Don, the Sicilian bridge, the gentleman gangster, died on his front lawn. And yet, no one really believes it ends like that. Because men like Frank don't just die. They leave shadows, unfinished business, quiet revenge curling through the streets like cigar smoke in a church hall. They say the insurrios didn't take it well. They say some people started vanishing again. And they say the sea off Palermo, once calm, is restless once more. The streets of Brooklyn had their own rhythm in the late 80s and early 90s. Sirens came and went like bad weather. Radios blasted old-school rap and Sinatra from corner bodegas. Pigeons shuffled on rooftops above alleys stained with oil, spit, and blood. In places like Bensonhurst, Bath Beach, and Diker Heights, the rules were different. The streets didn't belong to the police. They belonged to the ones who could enforce silence. That was the world Frank Cali walked into when he started making his way. Not with fists, not with fear, with observation. He wasn't like the old school guys, loud mouths and Cadillacs, flexing pinky rings and cheap cologne. And he sure as hell wasn't like the younger wannabes, the ones who wanted everything fast, women, money, respect, and a headline. Frank stayed quiet, always watching. He learned from the way a man entered a room, not from what he said. He picked up on the tone changes, the sudden tension in a handshake, the way eyes flickered during sit-downs. That made him valuable. Older guys, men with decades in the life, started to notice. They didn't invite him into everything, but they didn't push him away either. Because Frank never overstepped. He never begged for a job. He just made himself useful. It started small, driving, sitting in on collections, handling deliveries that had to be on time, but never talked about. He didn't complain, didn't cut corners, and he always made sure the envelope was sealed, the car was clean, and the story was straight. In this life, guys like that don't stay in the background for long. Frank was already tied into family through blood, but blood means little if you're stupid. Plenty of guys born into mob-connected families end up face down in dumpsters for opening their mouths or taking without permission. Frank didn't just survive the streets, he understood them. He knew who was about to flip before they flipped. He knew which guy couldn't handle pressure, who owed too much, who was getting sloppy with blow, and who was slipping info to the feds for the illusion of protection. And most importantly, he kept all that knowledge to himself. That's what made him dangerous. By the mid-1990s, Frank had already earned the quiet respect of key Gambino players. He wasn't a made guy yet, but everyone treated him like one. He never rushed that process either. He knew when a man pushes for that button too soon, it means he's weak, insecure. And in this world, weakness gets tested until it breaks. So Frank waited. And when the time came, the ceremony was quiet, respectful, and without fanfare. Just like him. He didn't celebrate afterward, didn't take a photo, didn't throw a party. He went home, kissed his wife on the cheek, and ate pasta with his kids. Because for Frank, getting made wasn't the goal. It was just the beginning. He moved through the Gambino family like a man walking down a long, familiar hallway, never stopping, never running, just progressing. He aligned himself with old world types, the men who had weathered the chaos of the gaudy years and were tired of noise. These were men who valued structure over spectacle. Frank brought exactly that. He was particularly drawn to business operations, not just loan sharking and gambling, but high-level stuff. Construction, companies, unions, port contracts, anything that could be manipulated on paper and moved through wires instead of guns. He used his Sicilian ties carefully, not as a threat, not as leverage, as reassurance. His message was always the same, whether he said it with words or posture. I'm not here to take over. I'm here to build. And that built trust. By the early 2000s, Frank was quietly overseeing multi-million-dollar operations. His style was managerial, almost corporate, but without ever forgetting where he came from. He knew how to talk to both a union boss in a boardroom and a wise guy in a pizzeria. That adaptability is what made him rise faster than most. When the feds were still chasing shadows from the John Gotti era, Frank was already 5 steps ahead. While they were digging through old rackets and outdated surveillance tapes, he was locking down new income streams, legit on the surface, dirty underneath. Warehousing, import-export companies, construction consulting, security firms. Everything had 2 faces. The front was clean enough for paperwork. The back? That was the part that mattered, and Frank kept it sealed tight. He rarely raised his voice. Rarely needed to. When he did speak, people leaned in. His commands were suggestions wrapped in calm, respectful tones. He didn't bark orders, he didn't demand loyalty. He created an environment where loyalty made sense. That's the difference between a thug and a leader. Frank was a leader. By the time 2005 rolled around, he had become the go-to man for cross-Atlantic matters. His family's old connections in Palermo were stronger than ever, and Frank acted as the translator, not just of language, but of culture. He helped bridge the expectations between the Sicilian dons and the American crews. That was no small thing. See, Sicily never forgot what happened in the 80s. They remembered the betrayal, the purges, the dead sons, the exiles. And they watched, carefully, as men like Frank started sending quiet signals back. It wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. Frank was key to that. He arranged sit-downs between men who hadn't spoken in decades. He handled wire transfers that had to be invisible. He ensured the port jobs went to the right contractors, Sicilian connected or American trusted. He orchestrated a slow reintroduction of the exiled bloodline, and he did it all without drawing heat. That's what baffled the FBI. They knew the Gambino family was back on its feet, stronger, quieter, more profitable, but they couldn't pin it down. The names on paper didn't match the muscle on the street. The usual loud suspects weren't calling the shots anymore. That's when the name A. Frank Cali started showing up in more intel reports. He wasn't a ghost, but he wasn't loud either. He made appearances when necessary. Weddings, funerals, baptisms, always well-dressed, always respectful, never armed, never wired, never careless, and never, ever, alone. He always brought someone with him, not as muscle, but as witness. Because Frank knew that in this life, perception is everything. A man seen alone is a man who can be targeted. A man seen with trusted company, that's someone who's protected. The FBI finally caught him in 2008 on wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy charges. Not murder, not racketeering, paper crimes. They thought they had him, but Frank played it like a gentleman. He took a plea. Did just over a year. No complaints, no leaks, no names dropped. When he came out in 2009, the Gambino family greeted him like a returning general. They understood what he'd done. He'd absorbed heat, protected business, proved his discipline, and more importantly, kept the family's name clean from major public scandal. After that, his influence only grew. He never declared himself boss, never sat at the head of a long table giving speeches. But by 2013, no major decision was being made without a nod from Frank Cali. And when Sicilian-born men started showing up more often in New York, clean-shaven, polite, and dead-eyed, no one had to ask who brought them. Frank was rebuilding something that had been shattered decades ago, not for personal glory, for the bloodline, for the family, for the thing that couldn't be put into words, that code, that silence, that history. By the time 2018 came around, most insiders already knew. Frank Cali was acting boss in name, but real boss in practice. He'd achieved the unthinkable. He had rebuilt the Gambino family into what it once was. Not a circus act, not a reality show, not a tabloid headline, but a machine. Quiet, profitable, feared. And through it all, Frank smiled, gently, softly, like a man who knew he was playing the long game, because he was. The waves that touched the docks of Palermo had seen centuries of power pass through. Bloodlines were born, raised, and often murdered on these stones. But in recent years, the names whispered in the narrow alleyways had changed. The old names, Inzerillo, Badalamenti, DiMaggio, had faded like dust from a forgotten ledger. And yet, they were coming back. Not loudly, not in a show of force, but in slow, deliberate steps. Handshakes and candlelit villas, quiet blessings from men in priest collars who remembered when murder was part of morning mass, and eyes in the shadows watching everything. The man behind this quiet resurrection wasn't even in Palermo. He was in Staten Island, Frank Cali. Back in America, he walked his dog every morning, nodded to his neighbors, waved at the garbage guys. But while his shoes touched suburban sidewalks, his reach extended across an ocean. He was rebuilding the bridge that had been burned in blood, and the Sicilians knew it. See, the exile agreement made in the 1980s had never been formalized in writing. It was a Mafia thing, an understanding, not a contract. The Inzerillos would leave Sicily and never return, and in exchange, Rena would stop hunting what was left of their bloodline. It worked. For a while. The surviving members built a quiet life in Brooklyn, Queens, and New Jersey. They didn't disappear. They just waited. Generation after generation learned patience, something most American mobsters never had. They went into restaurants, not shootouts. They worked union deals, not corner drug spots. But Frank did more than wait. He was the returner, a name whispered in Palermo long before anyone dared speak it in New York. Because Frank didn't just believe in rebuilding, he believed in reclaiming. To him, the Inzerillo name wasn't something to be hidden. It was history, legacy, something stolen by a butcher from Corleone who had died alone in prison, eaten alive by cancer and paranoia. Now, with Riina gone, there was space again. A vacuum in Palermo's underground world that could be filled not with bullets, but with old loyalty. Frank started by establishing businesses in Sicily, legitimate fronts, construction consulting, import-export companies. He didn't own them on paper. He wasn't stupid, but his fingerprints were there. The money flowed from Brooklyn to Palermo and back, quietly, safely. And the men. They began traveling again. At first it was older relatives, uncles, cousins, godfathers who had survived the bloodshed of the 80s. Then came the sons, the nephews, the next generation. They flew under tourist visas, ate at old family tables, kissed hands they hadn't seen in decades. It was symbolic, ritualistic, a return. Palermo's new crime families noticed. The Matteo Messina Denaro faction, still licking wounds after arrests and betrayals, watched carefully. They didn't trust Americans. But Frank wasn't just American. He was Sicilian American. He spoke the dialect. He carried himself like their elders. He didn't bring brashness, he brought business. That made all the difference. Back in New York, the FBI noticed something else. Cali had begun pulling away from day-to-day affairs. He wasn't micromanaging. He wasn't showing up at social clubs. Instead, he was sending envoys. Young guys, polite, clean, efficient. They weren't shaking down small-time gamblers. They were attending union meetings, sitting on zoning boards, shaking hands with foreign businessmen. It was a shift in power, but not one the FBI could explain. Where was the violence, the drug routes, the hijackings, gone or buried deep? Because Frank had learned something most mob bosses never figured out. Violence is noise. Noise gets you caught. Control, that's earned in whispers. Still, nothing stays quiet forever. By 2015, word began to leak through the grapevine. Palermo was no longer off limits. The Inserillo name was being used again in Sicilian territory, not as a memory, but as a badge. They weren't declaring war. They were coming home. Some accepted it, others didn't. In the town of Passo di Rigano, where the Inserillos once ruled, graffiti started showing up again. Not from gangs, from ghosts. Messages like, "Sangue chiama sangue," blood calls for blood. Frank heard about it from a cousin who had just returned. The kid was shaken, but Frank only nodded. "Let them paint," he said. "They don't own the walls anymore." But he knew the return wouldn't be welcomed by everyone. Old enemies didn't forget. And while Reina was dead, his ideology wasn't. There were still men who believed the exiles should have been permanent, that the Inserillos had no right to walk Sicilian soil again. Frank was careful. He didn't step foot in Palermo himself, not yet. He stayed in New York, where he had more control. But he sent messages, he sent gifts, he arranged meetings, and most of all, he sent money. That was what turned even the most reluctant allies into partners. Money. Clean, fast, reliable. Frank's network kept the local businesses afloat. He financed projects the Italian banks wouldn't touch. He helped families in trouble, covered debts, repaired old churches, paid for weddings. He acted more like a local politician than a gangster. And the old women in the town square? They loved him. They remembered the Inserillos, how they helped the poor, kept the violence outside their neighborhoods, punished abusers, paid for funerals when no one else would. Now their sons and grandsons were back, respectful, educated, loyal. And behind them all was Frank Cali. Back in Brooklyn, that shift was paying off too. With his international pipeline growing, Frank could afford to cut dead weight. He started quietly retiring guys who were too volatile, too loud, or too tied to old-school nonsense. No disrespect, no drama, just conversations. And if they didn't listen, they were given a choice: step down or be left behind. Most stepped down. The younger guys, the ones who wore suits, who stayed off Instagram, who read the books Frank gave them, they were being groomed, trained not just to survive, but to evolve. Because Frank wasn't building an American crime family. He was building a global one. The FBI, of course, was rattled. They didn't know what to make of it. Their playbook was written for street-level busts and wiretap setups. But Frank? He didn't talk on phones, didn't send emails. He communicated through dinners, hand gestures, eye contact, old Sicilian ways. They tried to flip people around him, but it never worked. He inspired respect, not fear. That was harder to break. Still, pressure was building. Frank knew that pushing too fast could spark the very war he was trying to avoid. Sicily was delicate. The American side was stable, but not invincible. One bad decision, one arrogant move, and the whole machine could collapse. That's why, in late 2018, Frank began pulling back even more. He stopped attending certain meetings, turned down invites to weddings, even skipped a funeral or two, not out of disrespect, out of strategy. He was minimizing his exposure, quietly handing more responsibility to his most trusted guys. He sensed something. A shift. A tension in the air. It wasn't coming from Sicily. It was coming from Staten Island. That's the part he couldn't control. The wild cards. The outsiders. The small-time guys who thought violence could solve ambition. The ones who saw Frank's quiet as weakness, not wisdom. And while Frank was playing chess across oceans, someone back home was playing with a loaded gun and a bad idea. But he never showed fear. Every morning he still walked his dog. Every evening he still checked the lock on his front door. And when a black pickup circled his block twice one week in March, he didn't call anyone. He just watched from his porch, eyes calm, shoulders square. Because Frank knew something no one else did. If it was coming for him, it had already been decided. He wasn't a made guy. He wasn't a soldier. Hell, he wasn't even connected. Just another restless wannabe floating around the fringes of a world he didn't understand. A drifter in Staten Island with a temper, some fantasy, and a loaded gun. The kind of guy who watched too many movies, thought Mafia power came from guts and violence instead of patience and bloodlines. Anthony Camello. That was the name. No history in the life, no weight, no respect. Not even an ounce of understanding about the rules that had kept men like Frank Cali alive for decades. But that's the thing. The most dangerous person in a structured world isn't the enemy across the table. It's the idiot who flips it without knowing what it is. Anthony thought he was making a statement. What he made was a mess. See, the FBI wanted to believe Frank's death was mob on mob. It made more sense that way. A power struggle, a silent coup, maybe even something reaching across the Atlantic from Sicily. But the truth was worse, dumber, messier, and for Frank Cali, insulting. The man who had rebuilt a crime family without firing a bullet died not by vendetta or betrayal, but by a confused kid playing gangster with delusions of grandeur. But we're getting ahead. Let's go back. Camello had a few things going wrong in his life. Job instability, obsession with politics, conspiracies, social media rabbit holes. He was in that strange age between lost youth and a future that wasn't coming. Mid-20s, full of anger, drowning in ego. And he started spinning. He believed in QAnon, thought there were secret messages being sent to him, that he was chosen to fight some shadow war against deep state enemies. And somehow, in that broken mind of his, he decided Frank Cali was one of them. Don't try to make it make sense. It doesn't. Frank had never even met the guy. Never crossed him. Never heard of him. He was busy managing international ports, union contracts, and laundering money through shell companies overseas, not fending off delusional nobodies. But Camello had drawn up this idea that Frank was part of the cabal, that he was the enemy, that he had to go. Delusion is the worst kind of weapon. It's sloppy, it's chaotic, it doesn't follow logic or codes, it acts. And on March 13th, 2019, Anthony Camello acted. It was just after dark when he pulled up to Frank's home on Hilltop Terrace in Staten Island. A quiet neighborhood, clean lawns, American flags, kids on scooters. The kind of place where people leave their porch lights on out of habit, not fear. Frank was home, family inside. He'd just finished dinner, probably cleared his plate, rinsed it in the sink. Maybe he was thinking about that call he'd have to return in the morning. A contact from Palermo. Another deal inching toward completion. Another win. Another day being one step ahead. Then the doorbell rang. Frank wasn't the kind of guy to ignore a doorbell. He believed in respect. That's how he lived, and how he died. He stepped outside calmly. No gun, no suspicion. Maybe he thought it was a neighbor, maybe a car accident. Someone needed help. That's how Camello had planned it. Tap his SUV, fake an accident, draw him out. It worked. They exchanged words, brief, civil. Frank, as always, kept his voice down, didn't escalate. Then the shots rang out, 6 of them, fast, brutal, center mass. Frank dropped near his Cadillac Escalade, his blood soaked into the same driveway where he'd once taught his kids to ride their bikes. He didn't even get to see the coward run. Staten Island lit up. Cops rushed in. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Neighbors screamed into cell phones. The headlines were immediate. Reputed Gambino boss assassinated outside his home. Everyone thought it was a hit. Had to be. The boss of the most powerful mafia family in New York doesn't just get dropped like that by accident. Rumors exploded. It was a coup. It was the Sicilians. It was a message. It was retaliation. But behind the scenes, detectives were confused. It was too sloppy. No backup car, no plan, no escape route. It didn't smell like mob work. Then they found the fingerprints. Camelo hadn't even worn gloves. He got picked up days later, scared, confused, talking nonsense. During questioning, he said he believed Frank was a deep state agent, a global conspirator, one of them, the cabal, whatever the hell that meant. His story changed by the minute. Then he asked to represent himself in court, showed up with MAGA written on his hand, tried to flash symbols. It was pathetic. Frank's people didn't even acknowledge the man. Because what could you say? The man who rebuilt an empire had been gunned down by a kid who read too many message boards and thought he was starting a revolution. The Mafia didn't mourn loudly, but behind closed doors there was rage. Not just because Frank was gone, but because of how. There was no honor, no war, no codes, no negotiation, just chaos. That was the worst part. Because guys like Frank built their lives around control. He didn't fear death, but he expected it to mean something. A rival, a betrayal, a final move in a chess game, not a random lunatic with a Facebook page. The wake was quiet. Men in dark coats, hands clasped, no jewelry, no press allowed. The family kept the cameras away. No one answered questions, no one cried in public. But behind the closed doors of social clubs and funeral parlors, the message was clear. This doesn't go unanswered. Now, here's the twist. They couldn't touch Camelo, not in prison, not in holding, not in a courthouse. He was under a heavy protection, monitored 24/7, isolated. But it didn't matter. They didn't want to touch him. They wanted to erase what he represented. So the machine kicked back into motion. Frank's protégés, the young guys he had trained, started cleaning house. They tightened ranks, reviewed names, found leaks, cut off excess, locked down operations, and most of all, they silenced the streets again. Because Frank's death wasn't going to be a symbol of weakness. It was going to be the last time something like that ever happened. And in Sicily, word reached Palermo fast. The Insurillos held a private mass. No press, no announcements, just a few dozen men in suits, heads bowed in an old cathedral where Frank's name was spoken like a myth. They didn't believe the official story, not fully. Some thought Camelo was a pawn, that someone pushed him, fed him ideas, gave him the nudge. Maybe, maybe not. But either way, the damage was done. Frank was gone. Yet even in death, his legacy deepened. The businesses he set up kept running. The international route stayed solid. The respect he earned didn't fade. It expanded. Because the old head saw something in how he went out. Dignity. No last-minute betrayal. No desperation. He faced the door like he faced every deal, with calm, curiosity, and readiness. The younger generation treated him like a martyr. The Sicilians called him Il Ritorno, the return, because he had brought back a bloodline, brought back a forgotten way of running things, silent, disciplined, profitable. And though he never stepped foot in Palermo after the Insurillos returned, his name was etched in their new foundation. In some circles, they say the Mafia ended with men like Gotti, loud, brash, doomed. But those who really know, they say Frank Cali was the last real boss, the one who understood that this life isn't about glory. It's about control, honor, silence. And that the streets don't remember noise. They remember who kept the machine running and who died with his mouth shut and his empire intact. After the dirt was thrown and the prayers were whispered, the world went quiet. Not just the neighborhood in Staten Island where Frank Cali had bled out, not just the church where mourners stood stiff and still in long coats and lowered eyes. The streets went quiet. And in the world Frank left behind, silence didn't mean peace. It meant something far more dangerous: restructuring. No public declarations, no war cries, no sit-downs in broad daylight. The men who stepped into Frank's vacuum didn't need to wear his suit to carry out his legacy. They understood exactly what had been lost: a once-in-a-generation leader who believed in discipline, not dominance. A man who didn't just operate the machine, but refined it. Frank had taught them everything they needed, and now it was time to prove they were listening. The first thing they did wasn't hold a meeting. It was cut the noise. Frank's old lieutenants, younger than most but sharper too, started moving through Brooklyn and Staten Island with blank faces and full lists. They weren't there to ask questions. They were there to clean house. Every guy who'd been too loud during Frank's reign got one last warning. You talk? You're out. You post on social media? You're out. You flash, you bark, you step out of line even once? Gone. No second chances. They didn't scream these orders. They spoke them at funerals, at christenings, at early morning walks through construction yards, or during cash pickups at small delis. Quiet voices, firm tones, hands on shoulders. It worked. The old streets fell back in line. Even the younger guys, the ones with flashy watches and half-smart mouths, started dressing like their fathers again. Collared shirts, simple coats, no selfies, no mentions, no names, because Frank's death wasn't just an ending. It was a warning. If he could die like that, anyone could. The second move was more strategic. Frank had built a hybrid empire, part Sicilian, part American, all business. His fingerprints were on construction unions, ports, garbage contracts, and private security firms. Most of those stayed solid. But without him, certain pieces started to drift. The Gambino family couldn't afford that. So his men, the ones he'd personally mentored, started realigning everything. No drama, just rewiring. They moved assets into shell companies based in the Dominican Republic, reinforced union contacts using charm, not threats, and they shifted money out of visible properties and into trusts, high-yield real estate partnerships, and quiet offshore accounts. They even hired outside help, accountants, not wise guys. That was Frank's influence. He had taught them that power wasn't in the gun, it was in the signature. The silent control of where the money goes, who gets it, and who thinks they're in charge when they're not. Behind the scenes, something else was happening too. The Sicilians weren't done. In Palermo, word of Frank's assassination was taken personally. He wasn't just their contact in America. He was their link, their blood. A trusted figure who could speak both languages of culture, of business, and of family. They didn't want revenge on some no-name kid like Anthony Camello. That would have been beneath them. But they did want revenge on chaos. They wanted the message reinforced. This thing of ours is not broken. It bends, but it doesn't break. So they started quietly supporting Frank's successors, not with bodies, with money, with approval, with access to old world routes, shipping lanes, smugglers, buyers. A soft reformation of the American-Sicilian alliance. Frank had built the bridge. They were keeping it open. One of the men now leading the charge in New York had once been dismissed as too young by the older generation. In his late 30s, sharp suit, no tattoos, married with 2 kids and a church attendance record that made even his enemies uneasy. Let's call him Vinny D. Not because it was his real name, but because that's how he moved. Quiet, coded, and clean. Vinny D wasn't flashy, but he had a long memory. He'd driven for Frank, sat in on delicate meetings, knew when to keep his mouth shut and when to ask one perfect question. He didn't want the top seat, but when the other guys looked around, he was the only one they trusted to sit in it. He didn't say yes. He just started making calls, reorganizing crews, assigning new responsibilities, stepping into Frank's role without pretending to be Frank. Because that was important. No one could be Frank. Vinny didn't try to be. He just kept things moving. Meanwhile, the authorities scrambled to make sense of it all. They were prepared for an old-school mob war after Frank's death. Wiretaps were approved. Surveillance vans parked outside pizzerias and construction sites. Undercover agents were dusted off and reinserted into old neighborhoods. They expected blood. They got stability. The Gambinos didn't make a move in public. No shootings, no firebombings, no retaliatory murders, just business as usual, tighter, cleaner, quieter than before. That frustrated the FBI. One agent even admitted off the record, "It's like we hit them with a hammer, and they got quieter, more professional. That's not what usually happens." That's because Frank had created something more resilient than any boss before him. He didn't build a crime family. He built a system. Systems don't collapse with one loss. But inside, not everything was so calm. Frank's death had left something behind that couldn't be hidden on paper. Anger. Not the kind that leads to shootouts. The kind that seeps into the bones of men who knew better, who had followed the rules, who had committed their lives to an organization only to see their boss dropped by a nobody. And in the corners of dark back rooms, that anger hardened into resolve. They would not let it happen again. Vinny D and the new inner circle made it a priority to protect leadership differently now. Not with bodyguards or bulletproof cars. Frank would have hated that. But with information control, every name that floated in public was removed. Every guy who wanted a taste of the spotlight got cut. Social clubs were restructured. Associates were told to stay out of public eye, completely. They re-emphasized the old rule. You live long if no one knows your name. At the same time, they began looking inward. Who had opened the door? Not literally, but symbolically. How did Camelo know where Frank lived? How was he able to approach him without any interruption? Who, intentionally or not, had let that happen? They didn't blame the family. Frank had insisted on living simply. No entourage, no show. But someone, somewhere, had talked. It didn't matter if it was direct or indirect. Someone had opened their mouth. And in this world, even a whisper can get someone buried. There were disappearances in the months after Frank's murder. Not many, 3 or 4. Quiet ones. The kind of guys who knew too much, drank too much, or asked the wrong questions too loudly. Vinny never confirmed any of it. Didn't have to. The message was felt. This family is done bleeding. By the time the 1-year mark of Frank's death came around, the landscape had shifted again. Camelo was locked up in a mental facility, declared unfit for trial. The media stopped asking questions. The FBI moved on to newer targets. But the streets, they remembered. Frank Cali's name was now spoken with the same reverence as Paul Castellano, Carlo Gambino, and other legends of the life. Not because he was a killer, but because he was a builder. And in the shadows he left behind, his legacy was doing exactly what he always intended. Growing. Silently, steadily, smart. Vinny D's crew expanded into Jersey. Old ports in Newark reopened under different management. Unions once considered hostile suddenly became cooperative. And overseas, the Sicilian pipeline grew fatter and smoother than ever. Frank Cali was gone, but the structure he left behind was more alive than ever. The wise guys of the new generation didn't look the way they used to. They didn't sit on milk crates outside of pork stores all day. They didn't play cards in smoke-filled social clubs wearing cheap suits and gold pinky rings. They didn't shout across diners or bark into payphones on corners. That version of the life, it was done. Frank Cali made sure of it. He didn't lecture about it. He didn't threaten anyone into changing. He just moved differently, and the ones who paid attention understood why he lasted so long. He was teaching without teaching, and the smart ones caught on before it was too late. Now, in the years after his death, his blueprint was the only one that worked. The guys who ignored it, either locked up, washed out, or worse. You could see the shift in the way business was handled on the street. There weren't as many guys leaning on diners or walking around with envelopes anymore. Now it was office buildings, warehouses, work vans with fake construction logos, and union cards that doubled as key cards. The new wise guys came in quiet. They wore polos, not tracksuits, drove sedans, not Cadillacs, used encrypted phones, or better yet, no phones at all. And they didn't talk about the life like it was a movie. Because Frank had made one thing clear before he died. If you need to look like a gangster to feel like a man, you're already a dead man. The young guys who came up after Frank weren't made overnight. That was the old school mistake. Pushing guys up too quick, giving titles to people who hadn't bled for it. Vinny D, now unofficially steering the family, kept things slow, just like Frank had. No one got made unless they were proven, not just loyal. Loyalty was easy to fake. Respect? That was earned when a man held his mouth shut under pressure, when he passed money without stealing, when he followed orders without turning it into a performance. Those were the guys who rose, and they were being trained not just in street work, but in books, in finance, in the ins and outs of contracts, zoning boards, city inspectors, and licensing loopholes. Frank had started that. Vinny expanded it. They called it quiet money. It meant building wealth that didn't look like wealth. Instead of flashy clubs, they bought laundromats, warehouses, office supply chains. They bought into city contracting companies and commercial real estate investment groups. Nothing exciting. Nothing you'd brag about in a social club. But it paid. And more importantly, it was clean enough. Frank understood this early on. You'll never stop them from watching you, but you can make them waste their time. That's what the young guys started to learn. If you bury the dirt under 10 layers of paperwork, city approvals, and clean payrolls, even the feds get bored. There were still crews working the traditional rackets, gambling, loans, muscle. But now, they were handled with surgical precision. No beatdowns in public, no baseball bats in back alleys. If someone got out of line, they got a polite phone call and a deadline. If they didn't listen, they didn't get hurt. They got replaced, locked out, outbid, outmaneuvered. Violence wasn't off the table, but it was Plan Z. Frank had taught them that fear fades, control stays. The respect for Frank's legacy ran deep, especially among the guys who'd been around long enough to see the change. There was an old-timer, let's call him Louis V, a guy who'd done serious time back in the day. Hard-nosed, sharp-tongued, all Brooklyn. He'd survived the Gotti years, the Castellano years, the wiretap years. At first, he'd laughed at Frank's way of doing things. This kid walks like a priest and talks like a fucking schoolteacher. But after Frank died, and the chaos never came, Louis started telling younger guys, if you want to live past 50, walk like him. That was the shift. Even the old heads started admitting the flashy way of doing things was dead. And Frank's quiet method, that long game, was the only path forward. Vinny D, Frank's protege, knew the streets were watching him now. He didn't take that lightly. He didn't throw his weight around or hold a fake coronation meeting like some movie gangster. He just started moving pieces. He met with Sicilian contacts, reinforced that bridge Frank built, took care of the old guys who'd stayed loyal, and gave the young guys a clear path forward, one that didn't end in handcuffs or a bullet in the back of the head. His biggest move? Institutionalizing loyalty. He started pairing younger earners with older mentors, not just as street teachers, as handlers. If a guy stepped out of line, it wasn't just his own ass on the line. It reflected on his mentor, too. That accountability tightened things fast. Mistakes dropped, sloppiness disappeared, the streets got smarter and colder. But not everything was business in order. There was still grief in the organization, the kind that doesn't come out with words or tears. It came out in the quiet toasts behind closed doors, in the black and white photo of Frank that hung above a small altar in the back of a certain pizzeria in Carroll Gardens, in the silence that fell every time someone mentioned Hilltop Terrace, the place where he took his final steps. For the men who had loved him, followed him, bled for him, that pain never went away, but they carried it with discipline, not for revenge, not for show, but because that's what Frank would have done. The young guys knew this too. even the ones who'd never met him directly. They'd grown up hearing about the man who rebuilt the family without shouting once, the man who turned silence into power, the man who died without begging. To them, Frank Cali wasn't just history, he was the standard. And when they spoke about him, which wasn't often, it wasn't with loud praise, it was with small nods, lowered voices, a glance toward the framed photo in the back of the room. Because in the life Frank had built, the less you said, the more it meant. The thing about Frank Cali was, even when he wasn't in the room, you felt like he was. That didn't stop when he died. If anything, his absence echoed louder than his presence ever did, especially in the rooms where deals were made, envelopes were passed, and eyes looked across the table with silent agreements. Because Frank didn't just build an operation. He built a vision, one that stretched far beyond Staten Island, beyond New York, beyond even the American underworld. He had plans that hadn't yet unfolded, and the men closest to him, Vinny D, Nino, Big Gino, a few others whose names never appeared in papers. They knew the blueprint. Frank had laid it out piece by piece over years, not as a roadmap written in ink, as conversations over espresso, murmurs in the back of construction offices, suggestions passed across folding chairs at family barbecues. It was subtle, but it was real. The message was always the same. We've got too many eggs in this basket. Time to spread. Frank believed the American Mafia, as it stood, had become a wounded animal, monitored, tapped, overexposed. Everything they did in the States was harder now, not because the feds were smarter, but because technology had made privacy extinct. Cameras on every building, metadata on every call, drones, satellites, facial recognition. The old ways of doing things, extortion, hijacking, street gambling, were dying. Frank wasn't trying to preserve the past, he was trying to replace it, and for that he needed a new playground. His eyes had been on South America, parts of Eastern Europe and Northern Africa, not for drugs, not for guns, for logistics. Ports. That's where the future was. Frank understood that better than any American gangster alive at the time. He wasn't trying to smuggle bricks of cocaine or crates of stolen weapons. That was low level, risky, traceable. What Frank wanted was access. Control of supply routes, shipping lanes, and the quiet systems that moved cargo between continents. Not just illegal cargo, any cargo. Because in today's world, a shipment of legitimate goods could hold all kinds of value if the paperwork was tweaked, if a few inspections were skipped, if the cargo was slightly heavier than listed. He was already working with container logistics companies out of Morocco and Algeria, quietly, of course. The names on the licenses were locals, the brokers were clean. But the money? That was Gambino money, funneled through layers of holding companies, trusts, and silent partners. One of the most promising ventures was in Albania. Frank had made a contact there in 2016, a port-side businessman named Ilir, connected to both the shipping industry and local criminal networks. Frank met him through a Sicilian associate who had family ties in Durrës, one of the largest commercial ports in the Adriatic. The idea wasn't flashy. It was genius. They'd finance a shipping route that ran between Durrës, Palermo, and a small port in southern Italy, a triangle of controlled logistics. On the surface, medical supplies, kitchen appliances, farming equipment, but once the operation was smooth, the possibilities became endless. Counterfeit goods, tax avoidance, luxury items rerouted for private resale, high-value electronics sold off manifest, and most importantly, the chance to disappear product in the shuffle. Frank also had his eye on Panama. The canal was still one of the busiest arteries in the world. He'd sent a man down there, a guy named Tony R., not a hitter, but a businessman with dual citizenship and a background in import-export. Tony set up shop under a dummy brand, started meeting people, attending logistics expos, getting his face seen, but never tied to anything illegal. Frank's plan was long-term, build leverage, influence local officials, grease the right hands, not to smuggle drugs, but to control what gets held up and what passes through. A legal shipment delayed by 3 days could cost corporations millions. Frank knew that. He didn't want to move drugs through Panama. He wanted to control the flow of legal shipping for leverage, to squeeze businesses when necessary, offer help when they needed speed, and collect favors from people who didn't want delays. It was the new extortion, corporate, sanitized, bloodless, and the feds hadn't caught on. Not yet. Frank's big play, though, was Palermo itself, the old world. His family had once ruled it. Before Riina turned Sicily into a graveyard, the Inzurios had returned, but they were still laying low, still finding their footing. Frank wanted Palermo to become the European hub. He envisioned a time when legitimate shipping between Africa and southern Italy would quietly pass through Palermo under the guidance of men who owed him everything, who remembered that it was Frank Cali who opened the door for the Inzurios to come back from exile. And Palermo was hungry. The city had been bled dry by decades of Mafia war, government crackdowns, and economic failure. Frank wasn't coming in with guns. He was coming in with jobs, construction contracts, infrastructure investments, equipment leasing, shipping deals. He'd already lined up engineers and companies in the U.S. willing to invest in southern Italy, as long as someone like Frank handled the red tape. And he would have done it, if he hadn't answered the door that night. After his death, those plans didn't stop. They slowed. They hesitated. Some went dormant. But the men closest to Frank knew exactly what had been in motion, Vinny D especially. He didn't try to take over the international side. That wasn't his strength. But he did something better. He preserved it. He kept the lines warm, checked in with Ilir in Albania, sent messages to Palermo through trusted cousins, kept Tony R. in Panama funded and protected. He made it clear that Frank's vision hadn't died. It was just paused. They renamed a shipping subsidiary in his honor, FC Holdings, and ran it through layers of shell companies registered in Liechtenstein, the Caymans, and a few nameless LLCs out of Delaware. No red flags, no fanfare, just Frank's initials quietly moving product across oceans. And the Sicilians, they mourned Frank harder than most, because he was their last hope at building a real transatlantic machine, one that combined old loyalty with modern infrastructure. Still, they didn't fold. They kept their end of the bridge intact. And over time, they began building their own half of the vision, not in memory of Frank as a boss, but in respect for the man who gave them a way back. Palermo's underworld began to reform, slower, smarter, more global. Less about neighborhood extortion, more about quiet control of commerce, and they credited Frank for that shift. Not with statues or photos, but with behavior. They stopped the old feuds. They started attending Frank's annual memorial mass. They funneled profits into FC Holdings like clockwork. And they waited for the American side to find its feet again. Back in New York, the young guys had no idea how big the picture had become. They thought they were just earning for a local crew. But behind the checks, behind the drywall contracts and union jobs, there was something bigger moving through. Frank's shadow, his system, his logic, his silence. Even in death, he was making money, moving cargo, pulling strings across continents. And the men who kept it running? They didn't want credit. They wanted continuity. Because the best way to honor Frank Cali wasn't to wear his ring or sit in his chair. It was to finish what he started and do it the same way he lived, quietly, carefully, completely. Power used to come from fear. A guy walks into a bakery, smacks the owner around, and tells him, "You pay us or your windows don't make it through the week." That was how the old school did it. Intimidation, presence, blood on the floor, and cash in the bag. It worked for a while. But Frank Cali saw what the others didn't. He saw where the real muscle lived in the 21st century. Not on the street, not in a back room with a bat, not in a trunk with duct tape and a shovel. Power had moved. Now it wore suits, sat on zoning boards, managed re-election campaigns, and wrote city ordinances no one ever bothered to read. And Frank moved right along with it. Years before his death, While others were busy flexing their chest in corner booths and chasing old-school glory, Frank was sitting across from city officials, developers, and mid-level politicians in diners, fundraisers, and charity galas. Not flashy, not photographed. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed to be remembered. He made friends in places where gangsters had no business being, and he wasn't buying them the way most thought, not with envelopes full of hundreds or whispered threats in parking garages. Frank used protection, the political kind. You've got a struggling candidate in the Bronx? Frank gets his crew to quietly rally support from a few construction firms, a sanitation union, maybe a couple of local business owners who suddenly feel motivated to donate to the campaign. Next thing you know, the guy's in office, not because he knows Frank, but because Frank made the path clear. And when the time comes for approvals on a new building permit, or when a regulation gets drafted that might impact a piece of land Frank's holding through 4 shell companies, that same official doesn't even realize he's making a decision for the mob. He's just supporting his backers. That was the play. Frank didn't want control. He wanted coincidence. By 2015, he'd quietly positioned men, not gangsters, but guys connected to guys, on multiple city boards. The building department, the sanitation commission, local labor union liaisons, small business advisory councils. None of these people had Gambino ties on paper, but they all had a reason to take Frank's call if he ever needed something moved, halted, delayed, or fast-tracked. It was legal extortion, and it was damn near untraceable. Take one project as an example. A waterfront redevelopment in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Multi-million-dollar job, big firms involved. And right in the middle of the logistical nightmare was waste removal and contracting. Frank had long-standing business ties to the waste companies, most owned by clean fronts but controlled from behind the scenes by his crew. Legit trucks, real contracts, but the rates? Always just a little higher than average, and once they were inside, the job never moved without their approval. How? Simple. They had someone in the planning department who accidentally delayed other vendor permits. Suddenly, Frank's people were the only ones cleared to do the work. No threats, no guns, just slow paperwork and selective green lights. And it worked like that in half a dozen projects, not just in Brooklyn, but Queens, Staten Island, Jersey. By the time anyone suspected a pattern, the money had already been made, laundered, and moved offshore. What shocked investigators after Frank's death wasn't just how far his web reached. It was how clean it looked. Frank had spent years cultivating lawyers, not the flashy ones who chased headlines, the quiet ones who knew tax law, zoning loopholes, and civil litigation better than anyone. Guys who knew how to bury paperwork inside stacks of revisions, clause changes, and language that would take 6 attorneys a month to understand. He had consultants who never knew they were working for him, advisors who build companies that were actually owned by trusts linked to Frank's wife's cousin's holding firm. Every move was made in a way that no one ever saw the whole picture, not even the guys inside. That was intentional. Frank knew the feds were always watching. What he built was meant to survive the spotlight, not hide from it. A fully functional ecosystem of political influence, legal protection, and financial insulation. And the scary part? Most of it was still running after he was dead. Vinny D and the inner circle didn't try to expand the political side after Frank died. That wasn't their lane. But they weren't stupid either. They kept the machine fed. The officials Frank had once supported, they stayed supported. The consultants, the lawyers, the friends of the family in high places, they kept getting work, kept being treated well, kept being invited to the right events. Because Frank's people understood one rule above all. Loyalty isn't what you demand, it's what you maintain. There was one politician, never named publicly, but known in certain rooms, who had won a state senate seat with quiet support from Frank's circle. Nothing illegal, just community organizing, some unofficial construction endorsements. A few key votes swayed in union meetings, all legal, all forgettable. Once he was elected, his office passed a resolution blocking a zoning law that would have tanked a $28 million development project Frank had funneled into through 3 layers of companies. That was power, not votes. Protection. It wasn't just politicians either. Frank had soft pull in police unions too. Not with the chiefs or detectives. They were too exposed. He focused on retired cops, guys with long memories, quiet pockets, and access to old favors. They didn't help with crimes. They helped with intelligence. If a city department started investigating one of Frank's business holdings, the word would get to him before the letter ever arrived. If someone dropped a tip to the state board about a labor violation on one of his sites, it would get lost in the system for 6 months. Frank's structure relied not on force, but on the illusion of normalcy. Everything looked like it was supposed to, which made it harder to kill. After Frank died, federal investigators tried to trace his political influence. They got nowhere. Too many pieces, too many fronts, too many people who didn't even know they were part of something bigger. And the men who did know, they kept quiet, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because for those who had been pulled up by Frank, who'd watched him navigate both worlds, street and boardroom, there was a loyalty deeper than fear. Frank had made them belong to something, not just a crime family, a legacy. One of Frank's last known meetings before his death had been with a consultant tied to a lobbying group in New Jersey. The conversation wasn't recorded, no charges were filed, but those close to him say it was about something big, a land deal along the waterfront that would give Frank's shell companies quiet access to a potential private port terminal. Not smuggling, not guns. Control of a legitimate shipping hub that could be used to grease international routes. That deal stalled after he was killed. But 2 years later, that land went into development under a new LLC. The CEO on record, a lawyer with no known ties to organized crime. But the money trail? Same trust, same fund, same network Frank had built. He may have never set foot on that terminal, but he owns it, even now. That's how deep it went. Frank Cali didn't just play the game, he changed what the game even was. And the men still moving beneath the surface, Vinny D, the protégés, the next generation, they're not trying to be him. They're trying to preserve him, his way, his standard, his quiet dominance. Because the streets, they still remember the loud ones, the ones who burned fast and died young. But the real players? They remember the man who turned silence into strength and built a legacy that even bullets couldn't erase. They weren't the loudest men in the room. In fact, most of the time, they didn't even speak unless someone spoke to them. No tattoos, no gold chains, no tracksuits. They weren't the type to light cigars or brag about bodies. If you saw them at all, they looked like accountants, contractors, or maybe just the type of quiet neighborhood guys who always seemed to know everyone's name. But they were killers, in their own way. Killers of problems, killers of disorder, killers of threats, not always with bullets but with silence, leverage, or a phone call that made something disappear. They were Frank Cali's inner circle, and they didn't earn that place by bloodline or proximity. They earned it by thinking like him, by living his principles. There were 5 of them, not an official commission, not even a formal crew, just 5 men who handled different parts of Frank's machine, each one representing a key function in the structure he built: money, logistics, legal cover, muscle, and diplomacy. No titles, no chains of command, just roles. Frank didn't want soldiers, he wanted specialists. 1. Vinny D, the anchor. Everyone knew Vinny. If Frank was the heart of the operation, Vinny was the backbone. His job wasn't just to keep order, it was to keep momentum, to carry out Frank's vision after he was gone, but also to prevent anyone from twisting it into something ugly. He wasn't flashy, never wanted to be boss, but he understood every layer of the game, from street-level envelopes to international wire transfers. Frank trusted him with 2 things nobody else had: the full blueprint of the logistics empire and the authority to speak in Frank's name when he wasn't present. Vinny had been with Frank from the early days. He'd driven him around, sat in on meetings when other guys were still running poker games, and learned not just what Frank said, but what he didn't. After Frank died, Vinny didn't have to announce anything. He just started showing up where it mattered. He started taking calls that would have gone to Frank, and most importantly, he started saying no. To guys who wanted revenge hits, to guys who wanted to step into the spotlight, to guys who thought they'd move up just because there was a vacancy. Vinny kept the table steady while everyone else wanted to flip it. 2. Nino, the jeweler, the financier. They called him the jeweler, not because he sold diamonds, but because he could move money like a magician moves cards, smooth, clean, and with a little misdirection. Nino wasn't born into the life, he was brought in. His gift wasn't violence, it was numbers. He had a mind for offshore accounts, shell companies, wire transfers, tax shelters, and restructuring debt in ways that even IRS agents couldn't fully follow. He'd once been an accountant for a high-end consulting firm before a quiet tax fraud investigation cost him his license. That's when Frank found him. Not in a courtroom or on the street, but in a dull back office where Nino was still managing books under a false name for cash. Frank didn't ask for an explanation. He just said, "If you can hide their money, you can build ours." And Nino did. He was the man behind the offshore pipelines, the trusts, the silent partnerships that kept Frank's businesses separate from Frank's name. He handled legit contracts, discreet laundering, donation shells, and even helped fund campaigns through third-party donors. After Frank's death, Nino didn't change a thing. He showed up the next morning to the same office he'd always used, a small consulting firm front in Queens, and got back to work. He knew his job wasn't to take over, it was to make sure the money stayed untouchable. And 3, Big Gino Leone, the enforcer. Gino was the muscle, but not the kind that barked and pushed people around. He didn't have to. His presence alone did the talking. 6'4", barrel chest, hands like sledgehammers. But there was a stillness in him, a quiet that made people uncomfortable, like he was listening to everything, even when you thought he wasn't. He'd done time in his 20s, 2 years on a weapons charge, didn't rat, didn't cry, didn't blink. He got out leaner, smarter, and less interested in the street. That's when Frank pulled him in, not for his fists, but for his restraint. Frank didn't want guys who loved violence. He wanted guys who could control it, use it only when it mattered. Big Gino became Frank's guardian, in the practical sense. If Frank needed to be somewhere, Gino was already there first. If a deal smelled wrong, Gino sniffed it out. If someone was a threat, Gino made a call, not a mess. He also ran a construction security company, union-approved, fully licensed, and stocked with guys who'd once worn colors, but now wore hard hats. They kept job sites safe. They also made sure certain projects never got delayed or interfered with. After Frank's death, Gino stayed out of sight, but his presence doubled. He started walking routes Frank used to take, visiting properties he hadn't stepped into in months, just to make sure the quiet stayed quiet. 4. Paolo, Paulie Phones, the diplomat. Paulie got his nickname because he never stopped talking. But unlike the usual loudmouths, Paulie's talking had purpose. He was the guy you sent when something had to be smoothed over, either inside or outside the family. Disputes over money, respect, territory. Paulie could sit down with 4 angry captains and make them all feel like they'd won the argument. He had the gift of words, the ability to lower the temperature in a room full of boiling blood. Frank used him like a chess piece, not every day, not often, but only when diplomacy was the difference between order and war. Paulie wasn't a gangster in the traditional sense. He didn't like the life. He liked the people in it, the game, the art of negotiation. When things were too hot for Frank to touch personally, he sent Paulie. And when Paulie sat across from you, arms folded, voice low and conversational, you walked away thinking you got the better end, until you realized 2 weeks later you'd given up everything and smiled doing it. After Frank died, Paulie didn't stop talking. He just changed his tone. He became the go-between for crews that weren't sure who to follow now. He visited guys on the fence, reassured them, reminded them of how things had worked when Frank was around, and how they could still work now. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He convinced. 5. Marco Lace Belanti, the operator. Marco was different. They called him Lace because he threaded the needle, the guy who connected the things nobody else saw. He ran logistics, the actual operations, trucking, shipments, invoices, ghost workers, union greasing, contractor scheduling, and all the paper-thin details that held Frank's empire together. Where Gino protected Frank physically, Marco protected his movement. If Frank wanted something shipped from Newark to Delaware under the radar, Marco made it happen. If a container accidentally got inspected at the port, Marco knew who to call, not to stop it, but to explain it before the alarm bells rang. He wasn't a street guy. He wore suits, worked out of a converted office above a storage facility, and carried 3 phones, none of them in his own name. He understood supply chains the way other guys understood poker hands. After Frank's death, Marco became the spine of what was left. If Vinny was holding the family together in spirit, Marco held it together in practice. Because without smooth logistics, the entire thing collapsed. These 5 men were the real inheritance Frank left behind, not because he gave them titles, but because he gave them trust. They didn't rule the family. They held it. And while others tried to climb the ladder after Frank's death, waving around old favors or claiming ties, these 5 men didn't move. They didn't fight over who would be boss. They didn't need a new face. They just kept doing their jobs, silently, precisely, together. And in every move they made, one thing was clear. Frank Cali didn't just leave behind an organization. He left behind a system of men who knew what to do, because he made sure they'd never forget how. The 5 families of New York never mourned publicly. That wasn't the way things worked. No floral wreath signed by rival bosses, no televised statements, no dramatic sit-downs in candlelit rooms to pay respects. But when Frank Cali died, when bullets echoed across Staten Island and a man who'd kept chaos in check was lowered into the ground, everyone felt it. The temperature across the underworld changed, subtly, quietly, but permanently. Because Frank wasn't just a Gambino problem. He was a buffer, a stabilizer, the kind of man who kept the peace not with threats, but with balance, with leverage, diplomacy, and the kind of calculated silence that made deals stick. Now that he was gone, every family started looking over their shoulder. The Genovese were the first to feel the tremor. They'd had an understanding with Frank for years, a quiet split on certain city contracts, trucking corridors, and a labor union that covered Queens and the Bronx. Frank had personally ensured that boundaries were respected, even when younger earners from both sides got greedy. He'd prevented more than one fist fight from turning into a shooting, and the Genovese knew it. So when Frank's blood hit the pavement, there was a brief moment of confusion. Who ordered it? Was it a signal? Were the Gambinos coming apart at the seams? Vinny D and Paulie phones moved quickly. Within days, they sent a message through trusted intermediaries. It wasn't internal. No orders, no retaliation needed. Business stays as is. The Genovese respected that, but they also watched carefully, because power vacuums attract predators, and in this life, trust fades faster than loyalty. The Lucchese reacted differently. They weren't worried about Frank's death. They were worried about what would come next. Because while Frank had never pushed into their rackets directly, they knew that others would. Less disciplined captains, independent crews, young earners who saw Frank's death as an opportunity instead of a loss. The Lucchese didn't want war, but they started pulling back, pulling soldiers out of joint ventures, renegotiating percentages on deals, delaying shared shipments through Jersey ports. It was a quiet message. We don't trust the Gambinos without him. Vinny D had to send Marco Lace to smooth things over. Marco didn't beg. He didn't explain. He just presented the books. showed that every cent Frank had agreed to still flowed the same way. The Lucchese didn't shake hands, but they nodded, and the blood stayed off the docks. The Colombo family, what was left of it, saw Frank's death as a potential ladder. Their house was fractured. Years of infighting and bad leadership had reduced them to a shadow of their former strength. But weakness often breeds ambition. A few voices inside the Colombo crew started whispering, "Maybe we take some territory back. The Gambinos are distracted. We make a push." It didn't last. Big Gino made an unannounced visit to a construction yard in Bensonhurst, where Colombo guys had started supervising deliveries that didn't belong to them. No threats, no fights. He just stood there. 2 hours later, every Colombo guy on the job packed up and walked off. Sometimes, presence says more than words, and behind closed doors, the Colombo hierarchy, whatever remained of it, made it clear, we're not stepping into Cali's grave. Let them bury their dead in peace. The Bonanos were a different animal altogether. They had always been on the edge, caught between tradition and collapse, power and paranoia. Frank had never trusted them. Too many rats, too much heat, too many ghosts from their past still haunting courtrooms. But he'd still respected the chain of command, kept the lines of communication open, shared ports when necessary, even smoothed over a beef once when a Bonanno guy had mistakenly hijacked a Gambino-linked truck route. Now, with Frank gone, the Bonannos started sniffing for signs of weakness. They sent feelers, made vague suggestions about renegotiating shared business. Paulie Phones shut that down fast. He didn't threaten, didn't posture. He just leaned in across the table and said, "This is still Frank's house, you're just walking through it." The Bonannos backed off, because for all their chaos, even they understood one thing: legacy outlives the man. But the tension wasn't just within New York. Across the Atlantic in Palermo, Frank's death was treated with alarm. The Sicilian clans, especially the Inzerillo faction, had seen Frank as their link to America. The man who reopened doors, re-established roots, and protected their reintegration into New York's underworld. When he was murdered, their first reaction wasn't grief. It was suspicion. Not suspicion of the hitman. They knew the shooter was an outsider, a lunatic, a nobody. Their suspicion was political. Who benefits from Frank's death? They feared a setup. Feared that someone inside the five families had seen Frank's alliance with Sicily as a threat. Feared that his international vision, his expansion, had made him a target. And worst of all, they feared being cut off again. But Vinny D was smarter than that. He sent a representative, not flashy, not known, to Palermo within 2 weeks. The man carried nothing but a message and an agreement. The deals would stay in place, the routes would stay open, and Frank's vision wasn't dead. The Inzerillos didn't respond. Not right away, but they kept shipping, kept quiet, kept honoring the profit split. That was their answer. Still, under the surface, something had changed. Each of the five families, even those with no intention of war, started looking inward, making lists, auditing crews, tightening circles, because Frank had represented stability. And without stability, the streets start breathing a little heavier. Guys who never would have spoken out before began testing boundaries. Territory that hadn't moved in decades suddenly became negotiable. Old grudges began to wake up in the corners of social clubs and late-night conversations. No war broke out, but peace got thinner. The outer boroughs, especially Staten Island and Brooklyn, became more carefully watched. Sit-downs that used to happen monthly now happened weekly. Guys who never carried got back in the habit. Because the thing about a man like Frank Cali, he didn't hold the city together with force. He held it together by being the one everyone trusted not to snap. And now, with him gone, no one knew who that person was anymore. The FBI saw it too. Their informants reported changes in tone. No declarations, no grand gestures, but guys were walking more carefully. shaking hands slower, locking eyes longer, asking more questions before agreeing to anything. In short, the code was being dusted off. Because Frank had done something few in modern organized crime had managed. He'd made people believe the Mafia could still function in the 21st century, profitably, professionally, without being animals. And when he died, the belief didn't die with him, but it was shaken. The biggest concern was internal, not from rivals, but from within the Gambino family itself, because Frank had kept some guys on a short leash, not because they were disloyal, but because they were unstable. Now, they saw room to move. They started reaching out to the wrong people, hinting at old-school tactics, suggesting they take back the fear that made the family famous in the Gotti years. Vinny D saw it, so did Big Gino, so did Nino the jeweler, and they acted quickly, without bullets, without blood, just reassignments. A few guys got sent to Florida on expansion projects. Others got buried in desk jobs, cut off from real money. One or two disappeared entirely, not dead, just gone. Vinny wasn't going to let Frank's house turn into a circus, not now, not ever. And just like that, the streets settled again. Not calm, not peaceful, but contained. Because in the end, the 5 families didn't need to say it out loud. They all understood. Frank Halley's death shook the structure, but the foundation held. And as long as the men he trained still walked the streets, quiet, sharp, watchful, then Frank's order still ruled the city, even from the grave. Frank Cali never wanted to be famous. He wanted to be respected, feared where necessary, and above all, left alone. That was the dream. Build an empire, keep it quiet, keep your family safe, and die old with your name intact. But in the world he chose, or maybe inherited, that dream was always just a mirage. You could chase it, shape it, build fences around it, but the closer you got, the more it vanished, because the streets don't care how quiet you are. Not in the end. And Frank, he knew that. Maybe not at first, but somewhere along the line, between the silent deals, the long drives through Brooklyn at night, the whispered sit-downs where he convinced killers to wait one more day, he learned something. You don't get to walk away clean. Not when you're the man holding it all together. Not when you're the one who has to make the decisions no one else wants to carry. His family always came first. That's what he told everyone. That's what he truly believed. But being the man Frank was, the dawn in the shadows, the one who rebuilt the Gambino family without a single headline, meant the people he loved most lived behind walls, unseen, unprotected. Frank kept his wife and kids off the radar. No public photos, no charity galas, no walking into restaurants with entourages. He lived in a modest house on a modest block, the kind of place where no one thought twice when they saw him walking his dog or getting groceries. The people on Hilltop Terrace called him Frank, just Frank. Quiet guy, family man, respectful. His kids went to private school, not flashy ones, safe ones. His wife ran the household like any other suburban mom. Groceries, after-school pickups, church on Sundays. They had no idea most of the time how deep his world ran, and when they did know, they didn't speak of it. That was the rule. Unspoken, but understood. But it wore on him. Even men like Frank, men who seem unshakable, carry things. He didn't drink much, never lost control. But there were nights when he sat on the porch long after the house had gone quiet, watching the trees sway like they knew something. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing them. Because while the world saw him as a man of structure, of control, of cold precision, his family knew the other Frank. The one who read bedtime stories, who cooked eggs on Sunday mornings, who told his son, always let the other guy talk first. You learn more that way. That Frank never yelled, never hit, never disappeared for days. He was there, always. And maybe that's what hurt the most after he was gone, knowing that the man they lost had built a life so powerful, so feared, so deep. And yet, at home, he was just Dad. When the bullets came, it wasn't just Frank who paid the price. His wife was home. So were his children. The shooter didn't care. He rang the bell like a delivery man. And when Frank stepped outside, calm, curious, maybe even trying to defuse something before it escalated, the shots were quick and unforgiving. 6 rounds, right there in the driveway. The same driveway where he'd taught his daughter to ride a bike. The place where he'd once shoveled snow with his youngest son, both of them laughing, pretending it was a war against winter. Now it was a crime scene. Taped off, photographed, written about. Neighbors stood on their lawns, stunned. Helicopters roared overhead. Reporters shoved microphones at grieving relatives. The family Frank had spent decades shielding was now exposed. His wife never spoke to the press, not once. Not even when tabloids published her name, not when reporters parked outside their home for weeks. Not when strangers speculated about who she was, what she knew, whether she'd been part of the life. She grieved the only way she knew how, privately. Closed casket, no media, only immediate family and those close enough to Frank to have earned his final silence. They buried him quietly, just like he lived. But something changed in that house. The blinds stayed closed longer. The porch sat empty. The laughter stopped echoing through the yard. The price had been paid, but the cost didn't stop collecting. His children, too young to fully understand the game, old enough to feel the weight, would carry his name for the rest of their lives. Not Cali, the neighborhood man, but Frank Cali, the last real boss of the Gambinos. The news painted him a gangster. The internet branded him a don. The government labeled him a criminal mastermind. But to them, he was the man who told them bedtime stories about old ships, who made sure they did their homework, who watched every school play from the back row without ever announcing himself. His oldest son stopped talking for a while after the funeral. Just stopped. Not out of defiance, but out of something deeper. Confusion, shock, anger at a world he'd only just realized had been watching his father like a hawk all those years. The younger kids didn't understand, but they would. Eventually, someone would show them the articles, the documentaries, the grainy surveillance photos, the court sketches, the rumors. They'd learn who their father was to the world, and they'd have to carry that, like a shadow stitched into their name. Up to the guilt that lived with Frank's inner circle. Vinny D never said it aloud, but it ate at him. He had seen the shift in the air before it happened, the paranoia, the noise, the rumors about outside threats. He'd warned Frank once, subtly. "You want someone outside the house? Even just to look out?" Frank had smiled. "I'm not Gotti, Vin. I walk my dog. I answer my own door. That's how I've survived." And now he was gone. Vinny didn't let himself mourn. Not openly. But he tightened the reins after that. No one moved without clearance. No one stepped near a capo's house without layers of insulation. Family men in the organization, real family men, got extra eyes on their homes. Not to control them, to protect them. Frank had died protecting his own. Vinny would not let another wife bury her husband like that. And the bigger truth? The life had always come with a cost. Frank knew it. His wife had known it too, even if she never admitted it. Every time he stepped out that door, every time he took a late-night call, every time a stranger looked too long at the house across the street, she knew that the silence around them wasn't just peace, it was tension, a bubble waiting to burst. And when it did, it shattered everything. Even now, years later, the neighborhood remembers. People on Hilltop Terrace say they still walk a little faster past that house, not out of fear, out of reverence. The driveway's been redone, the bushes trimmed, the sidewalk cleaned. But the memory remains, that a man could build an empire without lifting his voice, that he could protect his family from the entire world until the world came anyway. That even in death, he left behind a name that people still whisper, still fear, still respect. And that's the cruel irony of it all. Frank spent his life keeping his family out of the spotlight, but in the end, the spotlight found them. Because in the life, no matter how quiet you are, no matter how clean you move, there's always a cost. And Frank Cali, he paid it in full. The night Frank Cali was shot, Sirens painted the Staten Island sky in red and blue. Neighbors whispered behind curtains. Streetlights flickered over blood pooled beside a Cadillac Escalade. And while Frank's body still lay under a white sheet on Hilltop Terrace, the media machine had already started grinding its gears. By the time the sun came up, he wasn't just a husband, a father, a quiet man known to his neighbors. He was Frank Cali, the Gambino boss, and the circus had come to town. The news stations were first. Cameras on tripods, lights in faces, breathless anchors shouting over each other about a mob hit in broad daylight. The word assassination was used more in 24 hours than it had been all year. It didn't matter that the details were still a mystery, that no suspect had been named, that no motive had been confirmed. The media didn't need facts. They had the perfect headline: reputed Mafia boss gunned down outside his home. They ran with it like wolves chasing blood. Old footage was dug up, clips of Gotti walking into courtrooms, archival shots of Castellano, of concrete suits, of the 5 families. Talk show panels were packed with former federal agents, self-proclaimed Mafia historians, and 1 or 2 guys who hadn't worn a wire since the 90s. They all said the same thing: this is the biggest hit since Paul Castellano. The mob is back. We could be looking at the start of a new Mafia war. They couldn't have been more wrong, but that didn't stop them from talking. The FBI scrambled, not because they were blindsided by Frank's murder. They were blindsided by how sloppy it was. In their minds, if someone had taken out Frank Cali, one of the most careful, calculated, and connected men in modern organized crime, it had to be part of something larger. So they activated every dormant surveillance plan they had, tapped phones, sent agents into bars and clubs where low-level associates gathered, dusted off informants who hadn't been used in years, and every time they asked the same question: who did it? Who pulled the trigger? What's the motive? What they got back? Nothing. No buzz, no rival crews boasting, no whispers of a sanctioned hit. In fact, the people closest to Frank, Vinny D, Paulie Phones, Big Gino, were doing the exact opposite of retaliating. They were pulling back, tightening ranks, saying nothing. That made the feds even more nervous. They're planning something big, one agent said in a leaked report. They're too quiet. In reality, they weren't planning anything, because the truth was worse than a mob war. Frank hadn't been killed by a rival family. He hadn't been clipped in a power struggle. There was no internal betrayal, no foreign hitmen, no Sicilian vendetta. He'd been murdered by a nobody. And that fact? It didn't fit the story the FBI or the media wanted to tell. When Anthony Camello was arrested, it threw everything into confusion. This wasn't a soldier, wasn't an enforcer, wasn't even connected. He was a 24-year-old Staten Island man with no criminal record, a history of bizarre behavior, and a head full of conspiracy theories. In his first court appearance, he showed up with his hand scrawled in Sharpie with MAGA slogans and political symbols. He mumbled about the deep state, about being chosen, about thinking Frank Cali was part of some secret elite that needed to be removed. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The prosecutors, the detectives, even the journalists, none of them knew what to do with that. Because it wasn't just a murder now. It was a mess. An unpredictable, politically tainted, psychologically unstable mess. But that didn't stop the media. They pivoted, quickly. If this wasn't a mafia war, maybe it was something worse. Maybe it was the decline of the mafia, the fall of the old guard, the vulnerability of the once invincible crime families. They rolled out the same talking heads, but now with new scripts. The mob can't even protect their own anymore. Is this the end of La Cosa Nostra? Was Frank Cali just in the wrong place at the wrong time? They loved the irony. A man who lived by the code, patience, silence, order, taken out by a delusional amateur with a gun and a fantasy. It was almost too good for them, so they kept spinning. What they never understood, and never bothered to look deeper into, was that Frank Cali's strength had never been in headlines or body counts. His power was the absence of noise, the calm behind the chaos, the deals that never got leaked, the enemies who never became threats, the families that stayed in check because Frank was the one they could trust to keep things steady. His death wasn't a power grab. It was a glitch in the system, a freak occurrence that said less about the Mafia and more about the world outside of it, the world Frank tried to avoid, a world of disinformation, broken minds, and a culture that confused delusion for destiny. The media never admitted that part, because it wasn't clean, wasn't cinematic, didn't sell. Meanwhile, the FBI tried to salvage something. They pushed charges on Camelo, tried to keep the case neat, but even the courts didn't know how to handle him. He was ruled unfit to stand trial, placed in a psychiatric facility, and forgotten by the public the moment the next scandal hit the headlines. But in the halls of the Bureau, Frank's name kept showing up, not just in his own case file, but in others. Money trails they couldn't crack, shell companies they couldn't trace, campaign contributions that didn't add up, union deals that always seemed to fall just outside the law. Frank's death didn't close any cases, it opened dozens, and yet none of them led to anyone with his last name. None of them held up in court, because Frank had built a fortress out of paper and silence, and when he died, the walls stayed up. The media didn't like that either. They wanted a clean ending, a new kingpin to replace him, a dramatic fall, a second act to the movie they thought they were watching. But it never came. There was no flashy funeral, no retaliation hit, no mobster interviews in dark clubs about who was taking over. Just silence. Just the echo of Frank's last footsteps across his driveway. And in that silence, the truth lived, that Frank Cali had won in his own way. Not by dying, but by leaving behind a structure too tight, too smart, too clean for anyone to burn it down. Even with cameras rolling and headlines screaming, the machine he built kept turning. The news cycle moved on, the public forgot. But in the streets, Frank's name stayed heavy, whispered in back rooms, nodded to in sit-downs, etched into the way things were done, even if no one said why. Because in the life, legends don't live in ink, they live in order, in respect, in the absence of chaos. And Frank Cali? He didn't just walk quietly, he made everyone else whisper too. The justice system never knew what to do with men like Frank Cali. He didn't fit their profile. He didn't explode across the city like Gotti. He didn't chase headlines, wear gold, chains, or get caught on wiretaps bragging about murder. He wasn't reckless, sloppy, or arrogant. He was invisible. And that made him dangerous in a way law enforcement hated, because you can't indict what you can't define. To them, he was a ghost wrapped in a suit, a man connected to millions of dollars, dozens of shell companies, deep union ties, and an international web of influence stretching from Staten Island to Palermo. And yet, on paper, just another quiet businessman. That's what made Frank so effective, and what made the system fail so completely. In their attempts to understand him, the FBI ran themselves in circles. There were financial audits, surveillance operations, wiretaps planted in cars, offices, restaurants. But the recordings turned up nothing. Frank never said more than what was necessary. If someone got too loose with language, he'd excuse himself. If a meeting felt too hot, he'd reschedule it through someone else, someone clean. He delegated just enough to avoid exposure and controlled just enough to ensure nothing slipped. Every time a federal agent thought they had a lead, it ended with another LLC in another jurisdiction, owned by another middleman who didn't even know who he was truly working for. Frank didn't just run the organization, he ran the illusion. A shadow play of signatures, favors, licenses, and logistics, all so well layered that when prosecutors tried to untangle it, they hit a wall of insufficient evidence and circumstantial connections. That was the design. Frank didn't just avoid prosecution, he studied the system and built his life around its weaknesses. There was a case, sealed now, where the feds believed they had finally caught him. A bribery charge tied to a union boss on a major construction project in Queens. The money trail looked solid. a 5-figure donation to a labor education fund managed by a Gambino-connected foreman, the same foreman who had recently moved up the ranks and started steering million-dollar contracts toward Cali-affiliated companies. The FBI pulled him in, put pressure on him, promised him protection if he flipped. He didn't, because he couldn't. When they showed him the documents and said, "Tell us how Cali's connected to this," the man just stared back and said, "I don't know the man personally." It was true. Frank never touched the transaction, never attended the meetings, never signed a single check. And yet, he had orchestrated every move. The agents knew it, but knowing and proving are two very different things. The case collapsed. The foreman walked. And Frank? He was already onto his next play. After his death, that case, and a dozen others like it, were reopened. The DOJ quietly launched a comprehensive task force trying to remap Frank's network. They gathered thousands of pages of real estate filings, corporate records, charitable donations, shell company transactions, and union communications. They wanted to reconstruct the web and find the beating heart at the center of it. But they never did, because Frank had built something even they hadn't expected, a system without a center. There was no one man pulling all the strings now, just a set of principles, patterns, and players, each trained to handle their slice without ever seeing the full pie. That wasn't an accident, it was engineering. The justice system was used to tearing down pyramids. Cut the head, the base crumbles. But Frank hadn't built a pyramid. He'd built a grid, each piece self-contained, each root insulated, each man replaceable. Some people inside law enforcement started to admire it, quietly, of course. One retired federal investigator who'd spent years chasing Gambino money put it bluntly in an off-the-record conversation. "Cali didn't beat us with guns. He beat us with patience." Another said he ran a criminal enterprise like a Fortune 500 company, with better risk management. Some even began studying his methods for internal reports, how he created redundancy, how he insulated top earners, how he used real estate like a vault, not to store cash, but to hide it in equity and development delays and rezoning favors. They couldn't convict him, so they tried to learn from him. Meanwhile, overseas, others weren't just studying Frank's blueprint, they were copying it. In southern Spain, a rising crime syndicate involved in real estate fraud adopted a structure eerily similar to Frank's. Trusts formed in Gibraltar. Construction companies based in Morocco. Silent financing from Swiss banks. In Albania, a container shipping firm linked to organized crime began mimicking Frank's dual ledger system. One set of books for investors, one for product that never officially existed. Even in South America, a drug logistics ring out of Colombia shifted tactics after Frank's model became known in certain circles. Instead of moving narcotics directly, they started using construction equipment shipments, just like Frank had done in his final years. Small, expensive, hard to track, easy to hide. Frank hadn't just changed New York. He'd changed how global criminal networks thought about survival. They no longer needed to dominate by fear. They could dominate by efficiency. And yet, for all his brilliance, all his control, the justice system still believed he got lucky. They told themselves his death had been random, that it had saved them the trouble of having to break him down in court, that eventually his empire would crumble under its own complexity. But it didn't. And it hasn't. Because the blueprint he left behind was stronger than the man himself. A blueprint based on silence over spectacle, structure over ego, delegation over micromanagement, business over blood. Frank taught his people not how to be gangsters, but how to be ghosts with bank accounts. Even now, in law enforcement briefings and organized crime reports, his name comes up. Frank Cali methods, Cali-style logistics, Cali framework. He's become a case study, a problem without a solution, a man who obeyed none of the usual patterns and rewrote the ones he had to follow. Oh, you don't see his name on RICO charges. You don't see informants naming him in federal transcripts. You don't see wiretap recordings with his voice threatening violence or boasting about deals. And that's exactly how he wanted it. The system failed to convict him because it never understood what he was. They thought he was a don. He was a designer. And while they were chasing capos, hitmen, and enforcers, Frank was building a network designed to outlive him. Not because he thought he was invincible, but because he knew he wasn't. And that's why, even now, years after his death, long after the headlines faded and the case went cold, Frank's machine still hums, quiet, unbothered, just beneath the surface. And every time an agent opens a file with Frank Cali's name on it, all they find is another door closed. The next generation didn't grow up in smoky social clubs. They weren't raised on whispered stories about Lucky Luciano or Paul Castellano. They didn't hang around card tables or learn how to break knees before they learned to shave. That era was dead by the time they were born. But they knew one name that still made everyone sit straighter, speak softer, and nod with respect. Frank Cali. Even if they didn't know him personally, his name carried weight like no one else's. Because he was the one who built something they could still live off. Not with blood, with blueprints. And now, as they stepped into their own roles, as earners, quiet operators, legal faces, and silent partners, they walked with the shadow of that name behind them. Not to glorify it, but to match it. Or die trying. The new generation of Gambino associates didn't come in through the same doors their fathers did. Gone were the neighborhood scouts who pulled you in after a fist fight. No more long bar nights with a boss in the back giving you your shot. Now, you had to prove your worth before anyone even invited you to sit in the room. The structure Frank left behind demanded results, not swagger. So the new guys, sons of old earners, nephews of dead soldiers, kids from the neighborhood with ambition and self-control, started showing up in unexpected places. Corporate offices with clean-shaven faces, pressed shirts, and silent phone calls. Logistics hubs, posing as mid-level management, working off burner phones and encrypted chat apps. Construction companies, with union cards in their names. And ownership stakes buried under layers of trust agreements. They weren't street punks. They were students of the system Frank built, and they studied quietly, like it was scripture. Vinny D saw it happening. He wasn't the boss, at least not officially. But he didn't need the title to see what was unfolding. Frank's death had shaken the foundation, but not shattered it. And now, years later, the framework was stronger than ever, filled with new blood that didn't want war, didn't want headlines, and didn't want to be remembered. They wanted to earn, they wanted to build, and more than anything, they wanted to be respected, like Frank. Vinny didn't recruit them directly. That wasn't his job. But he paid attention. He watched who showed up to funerals and didn't speak unless spoken to, who offered advice without making it about themselves, who could pass a package, fill a seat at a sit-down, or hold a silence longer than 5 minutes without squirming. Those were the ones he kept near. But not everyone in the next generation understood the balance. Some saw Frank's legacy and misunderstood it. They saw his restraint as weakness, his silence as fear, his order as hesitation. They wanted to bring back the fire, the reputation, the fear. They started poking around in rackets Frank had deliberately abandoned, extortion, street-level loan sharking, dirty muscle jobs that made too much noise for too little profit. They wanted the old glory. But the men who had stood beside Frank, the five, the quiet operators, the guys who kept the system moving, made it clear. That era's gone. You chase it, you'll end up next to it. And a few who didn't listen? They were removed, not with bullets, with silence. One was sent to Miami under the illusion of a promotion, a territory expansion. He lasted 6 months before he realized no one picked up his calls anymore. Another found himself audited, sued, and cut off from 3 side businesses that had once made him feel like a rising kingpin. A quiet phone call made sure the judges didn't favor his appeals. A third, he vanished. Not dead, just gone. Last seen boarding a plane to Greece on business, and never came back. No one chased him. No one talked about him. He'd been erased. Because this new era wasn't about heat, it was about control. And the few young guys who did rise, who did earn their button or their seat at the table, they shared something in common: discipline. One of them, known only in whispers as Dino, was a textbook example of what Frank would have called a legacy operator. He wasn't raised in the life, but he came from it. Father did 15 years and never talked. Mother worked 2 jobs and never asked questions. Dino grew up watching his uncles move money through pizza shops and dry cleaners. He went to college on a clean scholarship, majored in business, and came back with not just a diploma, but an understanding of how to protect the family without putting a target on its back. He opened a consulting firm. On paper, he helped construction companies navigate labor laws, tax credits, and vendor relations. In reality, he moved product, cleaned money, and helped 3 captains reorganize their crews into legitimate business arms with shared income models and no public hierarchy. Dino didn't wear a pinky ring. He wore a fitness tracker. And every older guy who met him, they walked away saying the same thing. If Frank was still around, he'd have made him a boss someday. That was the blueprint now. No flash, no mouth, no weakness. Everything earned, everything documented, everything wrapped in silence. It wasn't about being untouchable anymore. It was about being unseen. Of course, this brought tension. The old guard, the last of the wild ones who still carried the fire of the 80s and early 90s, struggled to find their place. Some had adjusted, reluctantly, to the clean books and new rules. They took their cut, stayed out of sight, and didn't ask too many questions. But others, they wanted more. They questioned the lack of violence, the loss of intimidation, the way young guys now called each other partner instead of cousine, the meetings that took place in boardrooms instead of back rooms. They called it soft. Vinny D heard it. He listened. Then he made a decision and called a quiet sit down. 3 older captains were brought in. The table was small. No assistants, no food, just black coffee and a short, cold conversation. Vinny didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. He just reminded them, Frank gave you this life twice, once when you earned it, and once when he kept you alive while the feds were swallowing families whole. If you want a third chance, leave now. They got the message. The meeting ended without handshakes. Within a week, 2 retired. The third? He was promoted to an advisory role out of town. He didn't resist. He knew what the alternative looked like. Meanwhile, the new generation kept building. They weren't just in New York anymore. Frank's international ambitions had left seeds everywhere. In Florida, Nevada, Texas, Toronto, Barcelona, Sicily, Dubai. Now, those seeds were blooming. Crews in Miami were buying into hotel developments, using the pandemic downturn to scoop up properties at a discount. A small crew in Spain, with backing from Palermo, was moving in on Mediterranean port contracts, positioning themselves to own distribution rights on both legal goods and black market tech. In Toronto, a partnership with a wealthy business family was opening the doors for a logistics firm with connections in oil, automotive, and luxury goods, all perfectly clean, on paper. And every single one of these moves traced back, in some shape or form, to something Frank had drawn up on napkins years before. His vision. Still alive, still expanding. But now, driven by a generation that wasn't blinded by street glory. They weren't trying to become kings. They were trying to become architects. They met in quiet lounges, in upper-level offices after hours, in group chats with burner phones and disappearing messages. They never used the old language, no capo, soldier, or made man. Instead, it was partner, contact, executive, and it worked. Because Frank's gift wasn't that he followed the old ways. It was that he updated them, rewrote the code, handed it to the right minds, and told them, if you're going to last, build something they can't even see. And they did. They're still doing it. Legends don't get tombstones. They get silence. They get space. They get the look men give each other when a name is said, then quickly unsaid. That's how Frank Cali would have wanted it. No gold-plated grave. No shrine with candles and black suits gathering every anniversary. Just distance between the world and what he left behind. But even silence has a sound. And across the streets of New York, through the ports of Sicily, inside the walls of rooms where names are never written down, Frank's story still echoes. Because some men die, and some men become structure. You couldn't walk into a social club anymore without seeing the effect of Frank's legacy. Not in posters or photo, he hated that, but in the way people behaved, in the order. Guys didn't talk loud anymore, didn't brag about their button, didn't throw around names like weapons. They worked quietly, clocked in and out like laborers, held meetings with legal paperwork on the table, used apps built to vanish, carried burner phones and clean records. They looked more like real estate agents than gangsters. But they were Frank's sons, even if not by blood. His true legacy wasn't muscle. It wasn't fear. It was durability. He took something that was dying, bloated with ego, riddled with rats, bleeding from the inside, and he gave it spine, structure, a chance to live again, not as a headline, not as a relic, but as a machine, built in parts, operated in silence, and made to outlast. Because Frank understood something very few men in his world ever do. Reputation dies when the man dies, but structure lives forever. Vinny D understood it best. He never stepped up to claim Frank's crown. He never needed to. Frank hadn't left behind a throne. He left behind a network. Vinny simply became the wire connecting it all. He moved like Frank had moved. Let others talk. Let others make noise. He made decisions. And when the time came to settle disputes, to cut off problems, to put out quiet fires, he didn't call sit-downs. He called systems into place. Frank's structure didn't rely on personalities. It relied on procedure. You mess up, you're removed. You talk too much. You're buried in silence. You try to bring back the old, loud way, and the machine swallows you, not violently, effortlessly. In Palermo, they still raise glasses to him, in quiet toasts, not loud ones. The Inzerillo bloodline returned to its seat of power with Frank as the bridge, the protector, the man who made peace possible between generations. He never stepped foot in Sicily again after that deal was done. He didn't need to. They called him Il Silenzioso, the Silent One. And even the youngest Inzerillo sons, who never met him, who only heard about him in whispers during Sunday meals, knew what his name meant. Respect without asking for it. His house on Hilltop Terrace, sold quietly through a holding company. No mention of who the buyer was. The records scrubbed, the past erased. But the driveway? The one where he died? It's been repaved, but something remains. Neighbors still speak softer when they walk past. Kids ride their bikes a little faster. Even the mailman, who's been working that route for 20 years, still says, "That man never raised his voice, ever. But when he looked at you, you listened. There's a weight that never left, not grief, reverence." The FBI closed his case, filed it under solved, mentally labeled it a fluke, the act of a madman. They were glad in truth, glad they didn't have to prosecute him, because they didn't know how. They had no wiretaps, no hard evidence, no flipped captains with his name on their lips. All they had were rumors, the kind of stories that made agents raise eyebrows in briefing rooms. He was moving product through legal shipments. He was untouchable in the unions. He had friends in 2 governments, but nothing ever stuck, because Frank made sure he wasn't a man you could stick anything to. He was a shadow behind paperwork, a handshake between 2 CEOs, a whisper that controlled $1 million with no fingerprints. And now that he was gone, all they could do was watch as his structure kept moving, perfectly intact. The guys who'd been with him the longest, the ones from the early days, they didn't cry at his funeral. They didn't kneel at the grave. They lived his rules. They built his vision. And every time they made a move that worked, every time a contract cleared, a deal closed, a silent wind slid across the books, they said it the same way, with a glance or a nod. Frank would have liked that, because that's what he left behind. Not a ghost, not a fear, but a standard. One of the young guys, a new blood, barely 30, was once asked in private, "You ever wish things were like the old days?" The kid shook his head. The old days got guys killed or locked up. Frank's way, it keeps the lights on. That was the lesson. Frank had taken a world built on chaos and refitted it for survival. No more streets soaked in blood for honor, no more parades for cowboys, no more rats because there was nothing worth snitching on. Everything was a business. Everything was clean. And if someone crossed the line, they weren't shot. They were cut out of the system like a tumor. Gone, forgotten. In a strange way, Frank won. Not the loud way, not in the stories kids write about in movies, but in the real world, in the way his enemies started copying his moves, in the way the feds still study his structure, in the way every man who walks through his machine today still benefits from rules he wrote and never signed. There are no monuments, no plaques, no photos, but his name lives in the things that still work, even when no one understands why. That's legacy. And now, the life moves on. Crews operate, contracts move, ports stay open, feds keep watching, but the core, the foundation, still Frank's. And those who whisper his name, they whisper it with care, not out of fear, out of respect. Because in the underworld, where most men go down as stories half told or forgotten in cells, Frank Cali became something rarer. Not a king, not a martyr, but a blueprint.